The millionaire pretended to go on a trip, but discovered what the nanny was doing with his children. There were no creaks in the lock. Robert had personally oiled the bolts the night before, setting the stage for his perfect trap. The house was shrouded in that deceptive quiet that precedes storms, or so he believed. His hand, firm and encased in a black leather glove, turned the front door handle with exasperating slowness. He carried his briefcase in the other hand, not because he had work, but because it was part of the disguise. He was supposed to be 10,000 meters up, flying to a conference in Sydney. The house was supposed to be empty of his presence, leaving a clear path for the new nanny to show her true colors. Robert hated uncertainty. Since his wife's death, his life had become a grid of schedules, rules, and obligatory silences. He had fired 4 nannies in 6 months. One for being 5 minutes late, another for using her phone while feeding the twins, another simply because her laughter seemed too shrill for a grieving house. But this Chloe was an enigma, too young, too inexperienced, and according to Mrs. Higgins, his trusted housekeeper, far too common for the family's standards. "I'm telling you, when you're not around, that girl does strange things, Mrs." Higgins had whispered that morning. With that grimace of fake concern Robert interpreted as loyalty. "The children don't cry, sir, and that's not normal. Children always cry. If they're not crying, it's because she's drugged them or scared them." Those words burned in his chest as he pushed the door open. The fear of a widowed father is a dangerous fuel. It turns into anger before there's proof. Robert entered, gently placed his briefcase on the floor, and sharpened his hearing. He expected crying. He expected to see Chloe sleeping on the sofa. He expected to see the television blaring, but what he heard froze him in the foyer. It wasn't crying, it wasn't television. It was a guttural, explosive, rhythmic sound, peals of laughter, not timid giggles, but deep, belly-aching laughter. The kind he hadn't heard in that house for over a year. It was his children, Finn and Liam. Robert felt a knot in his stomach. What were they laughing at? Curiosity and panic mingled. He advanced down the hallway, his expensive leather shoes barely grazing the polished timber, guided by the sound of someone else's joy, which felt like a personal offense in his solemn home. Upon reaching the living room threshold, the scene that unfolded before his eyes was so absurd, so surreal, and so contrary to any rule of etiquette, that his brain took several seconds to process the information. The room, usually a temple of minimalist order and neutral colors, looked like the stage for an avant-garde play. And in the center of it all was her, Chloe. She wasn't sitting, reading a story. She wasn't preparing bottles. The young, dark-haired woman was sprawled on the floor, face up, completely stretched out on the beige rug. But what made Robert's jaw drop in disbelief was her attire and posture. She wore that bright blue uniform Mrs. Higgins had insisted she wear, claiming it gave the house class. But on her hands, she wore bright yellow rubber gloves, the kind you use for scrubbing toilets or greasy dishes. "Up you go, my little champions." Chloe yelled from the floor with a smile so wide it seemed to distort her face with pure happiness. Robert blinked, stunned. His children, his heirs, the twins Finn and Liam, barely a year old, were standing on her. Literally, on top of her. It was a human tower of instability and jubilation. Finn was standing on the nanny's chest with his colorful sneakers stomping on the embroidered logo of the uniform, while Liam balanced on her stomach. The children wore their light denim overalls and white t-shirts and looked like tiny acrobats drunk on adrenaline. "Watch out for the squall from the north," Chloe exclaimed, moving her body to simulate a gentle earthquake. Liam, the smaller, more fragile one, whom doctors had said had motor issues, who barely crawled when Robert was present, was standing there, erect, his legs trembling with effort, but laughing with his mouth open, showing his few white gums. The baby stabilized himself by placing his plump little hands on Chloe's shoulders, using her as a balance beam, while his brother Finn raised his arms in the air as if he had just conquered Mount Everest. Natural light poured through the large windows, illuminating the suspended dust that the movement had stirred up. It was a picture of perfect chaos. Chloe held the children's ankles with her bright yellow-gloved hands, her legs stretched and taut, acting as the solid base for that human house of cards. To any outsider, it would have been a photograph of pure love, of instinctive connection. But for Robert, filtered through the grief of his widowhood and his obsession with control, it was an aberration. He saw germs on the gloves. He saw danger in the height. He saw disrespect on the floor. He saw an employee turning his children into circus attractions. Blood rushed to his head. The businessman, the cold strategist, disappeared. Only the terrified father and the offended employer remained. "What on earth?" he whispered at first, unable to raise his voice. At that moment, Chloe made an aeroplane sound with her mouth, and the children burst into a new wave of laughter, oblivious to the dark, rigid figure watching them from the doorway, his forgotten suitcase and bloodshot eyes filled with fury. Robert felt that this happiness was an insult to his pain. How dared she make them laugh like that when he, their own father, couldn't even elicit a smile from them? The spell broke with the sound of Robert's voice. It wasn't a shout. It was a dry, authoritarian thunderclap, laden with venom. Chloe. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The physical harmony that kept the three in balance depended entirely on concentration and calm. Hearing the roar of her name, Chloe had an involuntary spasm of fright. Her body tensed against the floor. The twins, sensitive as radars to environmental tension, stopped laughing instantly. Their faces went from euphoria to terror in a fraction of a second. Liam, who was on the nanny's stomach, lost his footing as he turned his head sharply towards the door. His little legs failed. The baby tilted dangerously to the right, towards the hard timber floor. "Careful!" Robert shouted, taking a step forward, but he was too far to reach in time. But Chloe didn't need to reach. She was already there. Her reflexes weren't those of a distracted employee, they were those of a lioness. Before Robert could finish his exclamation, Chloe had already released their ankles, and her hands, those ridiculous yellow-gloved hands, shot out like springs. With her right hand, she caught Liam in the air, cradling his head against her chest before it touched the ground, and with her left arm, she wrapped around Finn's waist, pulling him towards her in a protective embrace. In one fluid movement, she rolled onto her back and sat up on the floor with both children pressed against her chest, gasping. The twins, now safe but infected by the sudden fear that had flooded the room, burst into tears in unison, a sharp cry of panic that pierced Robert's ears. Robert strode across the living room, his face contorted. "Let go of my children!" he ordered, reaching them and roughly snatching Finn from the nanny's arms. "Let them go right now!" Chloe remained on the floor, her hands empty and trembling, looking up. She brushed a lock of hair from her face with the back of her yellow glove, her large, dark eyes filled with a mixture of fright and confusion. "Mr. Robert, you were supposed to be—" she stammered, trying to catch her breath. "I was supposed to be on a trip!" He cut her off, his voice echoing against the high walls. "And thank God I came back." "What kind of madness is this?" Robert held Finn, who squirmed in his arms, reaching his little hands towards Chloe and crying, Nanny! Nanny!" His son's rejection was like a physical slap to Robert. He clumsily put the child on the sofa and turned to Chloe, who was starting to get up with difficulty. "Don't get up," he snapped, pointing an accusing finger at her. "Stay where you belong, on the floor. Do you have any idea what could have happened?" Another centimetre, and my son would have cracked his head open on the coffee table. "Sir, I had it under control," Chloe tried to explain, her voice cracking but maintaining a strange dignity. "I never let them fall. We were doing exercises." Robert let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "You call that exercise? I saw you. You were sprawled like an animal, with those filthy toilet cleaning gloves, letting my children stomp all over you like an old piece of furniture. The gloves are new, sir. I only use them for play because of the color. They like the yellow color. It helps them focus their sight," she said quickly, trying to appeal to reason. "I'm not interested in your cheap daycare excuses." Robert ran a hand through his hair, disheveled for the first time in years. The image of the children laughing with her and crying with him was gnawing at him. "I pay you a salary you wouldn't earn in 10 years anywhere else. I pay you to look after them, to educate them, to teach them manners and safety, not to put on a circus act in my living room." Robert looked around as if seeking witnesses to the atrocity. "Look at you. It's pathetic. A woman your age rolling around. What would people think if they walked in right now? What would my wife think if she saw that the woman entrusted with her children treats them like toys?" The mention of his late wife was a low blow. Chloe lowered her gaze, biting her lower lip to keep from crying in front of him. She knew she shouldn't respond. She needed the job. Her sick mother depended on that salary. But Liam's crying, as he still crawled on the floor towards her and clung to her uniformed leg, gave her a strength she didn't know she had. "Sir," Chloe said, and her tone changed. It was no longer apologetic. It was a maternal plea. Liam was laughing. Finn was laughing. "They haven't laughed like that in months." I didn't hear laughter. "Hysteria isn't happiness, Chloe," Robert bellowed, blind to the truth. "Disorder isn't joy. You've confused freedom with anarchy. You've endangered my children's physical integrity for a stupid game. You're irresponsible." Robert bent down to pull Liam away from Chloe's leg. The baby clung tightly to the blue fabric of the uniform, crying desperately, burying his little face in the nanny's knee. Robert had to use force to peel his own son's fingers off the employee's clothes. "Come here," Robert growled, lifting Liam. The child kicked, hitting his father's chest with his tiny fists, rejecting the contact of the expensive suit and reaching for the arms of the woman in the rubber gloves. That was the last straw. Robert felt a pang of jealousy so sharp it blurred his vision. "Get out of my sight," Robert hissed, the child crying in his arms. "Go to your room, pack your things, and wait for me to decide what I'm going to do with you. And take off those ridiculous gloves. In this house, we are serious people, not clowns." Chloe slowly stood up, calmly removed the yellow gloves, revealing her red, working hands. She looked at the children one last time. Finn watched her from the sofa with huge, wet eyes. Liam was still crying in his father's arms. "I just wanted them to lose their fear of falling, sir," she whispered so low that Robert barely heard her. "The only thing they've lost today is respect," he replied, turning his back on her. "Get out!" Chloe walked towards the staff door, feeling each step as a defeat. Behind her, the twins' crying grew louder, filling the house with a noise that was no longer joy, but a heartbreaking wail. Robert was left alone in the middle of his perfect living room with two children who didn't want him and a victory that tasted like ashes. In the depths of the hallway, Mrs. Higgins's shadow watched the scene, and a twisted, cruel smile spread across her aged face. The plan had worked perfectly, or so it seemed. The silence that Robert so revered had been murdered, and in its place, a chaos of sharp, uncoordinated cries governed the mansion. Finn and Liam weren't crying like spoiled children wanting a sweet. They cried with the deep anguish of abandonment. Robert sat on the edge of the beige leather sofa, his body rigid and his arms clumsy, trying to hold Liam, who arched backwards with surprising strength for his size, screaming towards the hallway where Chloe had disappeared. At the other end of the sofa, Finn hit the cushions with his clenched fists, his face red and bathed in tears and snot, rejecting any attempt at paternal comfort. "Enough," Robert shouted, but his voice, accustomed to giving orders in soundproof boardrooms, cracked before the hysteria of his own children. "Finn, Liam, silence, Dad's here." But Dad was a stranger in a dark suit, with the scent of expensive cologne, an intruder in their world of games and warmth. Robert felt a pang of uselessness in his chest. He had millions in the bank. He controlled international companies, but he couldn't make two one-year-old babies stop crying. He felt small. He felt like a failure. And that feeling of failure quickly turned into resentment towards the cause of it all, Chloe. It was in that moment of extreme vulnerability that the shadow appeared. Mrs. Higgins didn't walk, she glided. She entered the room with the precision of a predator sniffing blood, bringing with her a glass of iced water on a perfectly polished silver tray. Her dark gray uniform was impeccable, without a single wrinkle, in absolute contrast to the vital disorder that Chloe represented. Her face, marked by lines of disguised bitterness under a mask of efficient servitude, showed a perverse satisfaction that Robert, in his desperation, couldn't read. "Mr. Robert," she said in a soft, unctuous voice, placing the tray on the coffee table with a delicate tinkle. "Have some water, you look pale." "I told you this trip back would be hectic." Robert took the glass. His hands trembled slightly. The ice clinked against the glass. "They won't stop, Mrs. Higgins. They won't stop," he murmured, running a hand over his sweaty forehead. "They've been like this for 10 minutes. What did that woman do to them?" "Missus." Higgins sighed a long, theatrical sound as she bent down with false tenderness towards Finn, though without actually touching him, as if the child were a contagious museum piece. "What did she do to them, sir?" "The question is, what didn't she do to them?" the housekeeper whispered, injecting the venom drop by drop. "She spoiled them, turned them into savages. You saw how she was sprawled on the floor with her legs open and those rubber gloves. She paused, dramatically, searching for the word that would most wound Robert's conservative pride. She looked like some common street performer, not an educator. Robert gripped the glass. The image of Chloe on the floor laughing came back to him. Now, filtered through Mrs. Higgins's words, the scene seemed grotesque, dirty. "She said it was a game," Robert defended weakly, not because he wanted to defend Chloe, but because he needed to believe it hadn't been that bad. "A game?" Mrs. Higgins let out a dry chuckle, looking him directly in the eyes with compassionate seriousness. "Sir, I have served in the best houses in this city for 40 years. I've seen professional nannies. They read, they teach languages, they keep the children clean and presentable. This girl, this Chloe, she's from the gutter, sir, and the gutter is all she has to offer. Finn threw a wooden toy that hit Mrs. Higgins's shin. The woman barely blinked, but her eyes flashed with icy coldness towards the baby before returning to Robert with sweetness. Look at them. They're aggressive, out of control. That's what she teaches them. Disobedience. She enjoys seeing you lose control, sir. It's her way of feeling powerful. These poor young girls always envy good people. She wants to be the mother. She wants to take the place of your late wife. May she rest in peace. The mention of his dead wife was the final trigger. Robert jumped to his feet, leaving Liam on the sofa. The pain of his wife's absence was a wound that had never closed, and the idea that some commoner would try to usurp that sacred place blinded him with rage. She will never be like my wife, Robert growled, his jaw clenched. Of course not, sir. Mrs. Laura was an angel, a lady. This girl smells of bleach and cheap sweat. Mrs. Higgins insisted, stepping closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. But the children are innocent. They get confused. If you allow her to stay here one more day, they will forget who their father is. They will forget the name they bear. They will become what you saw today, a circus. Robert looked at his children. They were red, sweaty, their t-shirts untucked, crying inconsolably. They didn't look like the heirs to an empire. They looked like broken children. And in his logic, twisted by grief and manipulation, Robert decided that the fault was not his absence or his coldness, but the nanny's excessive warmth. You're right, Mrs. Higgins, Robert said, regaining his erect posture, hardening his heart. This ends today. I will not allow my house to become a slum. Mrs. Higgins nodded, hiding a triumphant smile as she smoothed her apron. It's for the best, sir, for the children's sake. We must cut out the infection before it spreads. Would you like me to call security to escort her out? No, Robert said, adjusting his tie knot with a sharp movement. I'll do it myself. I want to see her face when she understands that my family is not to be trifled with. As Robert left the room with a martial stride towards the staff quarters, Mrs. Higgins remained alone with the twins. She looked at them with disdain, pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, and wiped the spot where Finn's toy had hit her. Cry all you want, brats, she whispered to the still screaming babies. The party's over. The staff room was at the end of a narrow corridor behind the kitchen, an architectural frontier separating luxury from labor. Chloe stood there next to her small single bed. She hadn't unpacked much because deep down she had always feared this moment would come. Her suitcase, an old canvas bag with a worn zipper, lay open on the mattress. Her hands, now without the yellow gloves, trembled as she folded her street clothes. She didn't cry because of the dismissal. She had been fired before by demanding employers. She cried because she could hear Finn and Liam's screams piercing through the walls of the house, calling her. Each nanny was a stab in her chest. She knew Liam needed his leg massage before his nap, or his muscles would ache. She knew Finn needed to be sung the Grey Elephant song, or he wouldn't sleep. And she knew that Robert, with all his wealth, knew none of that. The door opened without knocking. It wasn't a knock, it was an invasion. Robert entered, filling the small space with his overwhelming presence and contained anger. The room suddenly felt tiny. Are you finished? He asked. His voice was dry ice. There were no shouts now, only a quiet, devastating disdain. Chloe turned, hugging a t-shirt against her chest, as if it were a shield. I'm packing my things, sir. I just need a few minutes. Robert took a step inside, scanning the room with a grimace of disgust, as if the air there was of lesser quality. He saw a drawing taped to the wall, a crayon scribble Finn had made the day before. Chloe had kept it as if it were a masterpiece. Robert ripped it from the wall with a sharp movement. The sound of tearing paper was violent in the tense silence. Don't take anything that isn't yours, Robert said, crumpling the drawing and dropping it to the floor like rubbish. In this house, everything is family property, even my children's memories. Chloe felt the blood rush to her cheeks. The humiliation wasn't about the money. It was about the denial of her humanity. Nico gave me that drawing, sir. It's just paper, she said, her voice trembling but maintaining eye contact. For you, it's a trophy, proof that you managed to manipulate them, Robert replied, pulling a leather wallet from his inner pocket. He opened the wallet and pulled out a thick wad of bills without even counting them. Here you go. It's your full month's salary, plus severance. It's much more than you deserve for the grotesque spectacle you put on in my living room today. He threw the bills onto the bed next to the open suitcase. The money fell scattered, some bills sliding to the floor. It was a calculated gesture to make her feel small. A commercial transaction to buy her silence and her disappearance. Take it and leave. I never want to see you near this property again. If I find out you try to contact the children, I'll call the police. I have lawyers who could ruin your life before you can even blink." Chloe looked at the scattered money. She could have paid for her mother's medicine for 3 months with that, but at that moment, the money felt dirty. She took a deep breath, swallowing her pride, and looked up at Robert. Her dark eyes, usually sweet, now shone with a dignity Robert didn't expect to find in someone in a cheap uniform. "Mr. Robert," she said, ignoring the bills, "you can insult me all you want. You can say I'm common, that I'm poor, that I have no class, but don't lie to yourself. What you saw today wasn't a circus. It was love." Robert tensed, ready to interrupt her, but something in her voice stopped him. "Those children are hungry, sir, and not for expensive food or imported toys. They are hungry for someone to get down on the floor with them. They are hungry for someone to touch them without fear of getting their suit dirty. You think you're firing me for being messy, but deep down you're firing me because it hurts you to see a stranger give them what you can't, because you're too busy being sad." "Shut up," Robert bellowed, slamming his open hand against the doorframe. The truth had struck him right in his wound. "You know nothing of my pain. You are just an employee." "I am the person who taught your son to stand up," Chloe replied, soft but relentless. "Liam wasn't walking because he was afraid. Today, he stood on me because he trusted that I wouldn't let him fall. Can you say the same? If they fall, will you be there to catch them? Or will you be worried about wrinkling your shirt?" The silence that followed was dense, heavy. Robert breathed raggedly, his eyes bloodshot. He wanted to scream at her, to kick her out, but her words had lodged like splinters in his conscience. The image of Liam standing, balancing, pierced his mind. "Out!" Robert whispered, pointing to the exit. "Out of my house! Now!" Chloe closed her suitcase. She didn't pick up the money from the floor. She only took the wad that had fallen onto the bed, just enough for the day's work, and left the rest, the humiliating tip, scattered on the quilt. She slung the bag over her shoulder and walked towards the door. Robert had to step aside to let her pass. She didn't lower her head. As she passed him, she stopped for a second. She didn't look him in the eyes. She looked towards the hallway leading to the children's rooms. "Liam only falls asleep if you rub his back in circles to the right," she said, her voice broken. "And Finn is afraid of total darkness. Please leave the hallway light on." And with that last instruction, a lesson of love disguised as technical advice, Chloe left the staff room and crossed the kitchen towards the back exit. Robert was left alone in the tiny room, surrounded by unwanted bills and the echo of a truth he didn't want to accept. From the living room, the twins' crying had changed. It was no longer hysteria. Now it was a tired, hoarse cry of resignation, the sound of a house that once again became cold, orderly, and terribly empty. Robert looked at the crumpled drawing on the floor, the splash of color in his gray world, and for the first time in a long time, he felt an atrocious fear of being alone with his own children. The hallway connecting the kitchen to the staff exit had never seemed so long. Chloe walked with her head held high, though inside she felt her legs were made of lead. Each step took her further from the children, and the silence she left behind was deceiving. Barely had her hand touched the back door handle when a heart-wrenching scream broke the atmosphere. It wasn't a tantrum scream. It was the sound of absolute panic. "Liam!" The crying turned into a convulsive cough. Chloe froze. Her instinct screamed at her to run back, but her dignity and the dismissal order pinned her to the floor. "Wait!" Robert's voice boomed from the kitchen archway. It wasn't a request. It was an exclamation of urgency disguised as authority. Chloe turned slowly. Robert was there, disheveled, his tie loosened, his face pale. In his arms, Liam arched violently, his face purple with the effort of crying, rejecting contact with his father, as if his designer suit were made of thorns. "He won't calm down," Robert said, breathing heavily. The arrogance of 5 minutes ago had cracked. The powerful man who moved millions with a phone call couldn't stop a 12-kilo baby from crying. "I tried to do what you said, the back thing, but it's not working. He's choking." Chloe dropped her suitcase. The sound of the canvas hitting the floor was the only reply. She walked towards him, not as an employee, but as an expert entering a disaster zone. "Give him to me," she ordered. Her voice was soft, but it had an underlying steel that brooked no argument. Robert, overcome by desperation, handed her the child. The instant Liam smelled Chloe's neutral soap and the texture of her uniform, the change was miraculous. The baby buried his face in her neck. His little hands gripped the blue fabric with desperate strength, and the screams ceased, replaced by broken sobs and deep sighs of relief. Robert watched the scene, stunned. He felt a pang of jealousy, but also a corrosive doubt that began to eat at his pride. "What do you do to them?" Robert asked, this time without anger, only with genuine confusion. "The best pediatricians in the country told me Liam is a distant child, that his motor condition frustrates him. That's why he's aggressive. But with you, he's a different child." Chloe rocked Liam rhythmically, ignoring her employer's presence, focused on lowering the little one's heart rate. His doctor read files. "Mr. Robert, I read your children," she replied without looking at him. "Liam isn't distant. Liam is scared. Scared that his legs won't respond. Scared of falling and no one celebrating him. You saw a circus in the living room. Liam saw a challenge he could overcome." Robert ran a hand over his face, frustrated. "You mentioned earlier that he stood up. That's impossible. Doctor, Miller was clear. Severe muscular hypotonia in the lower body. He said he might walk at 2 years old with braces. Don't lie to me to get your job back." Chloe looked up. Her eyes shone with an intensity that made Robert take a step back. "I don't lie, sir. And I don't want a job where I'm treated like rubbish. But I won't allow you to keep believing your son is an invalid just because you lack the faith to see him try." "Faith?" Robert let out an incredulous laugh. "Faith doesn't cure medical conditions, Chloe. Science does. And science says my son can't stand alone." "Then science is wrong," Chloe declared. "Or maybe science needs love to work. Do you think I was just playing on the floor? What you saw, that human tower, that isometric exercise. By standing on my stomach, Liam has to adjust his balance every second, because I breathe, because I move. His brain is forced to connect with his muscles in a way that no cold therapy machine can achieve." Robert fell silent, processing the information. It made sense. It was logical, but it was too simple, too humble to be true. "Prove it," Robert challenged, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "If what you say is true, prove it now." "Here." Chloe looked at Liam, who was already calm, his eyes closed, resting on her shoulder. Then she looked at Robert. She knew it was a risk. The child was tired, stressed. If she failed, Robert would have the perfect excuse to fire her and humiliate her for life. But if she didn't, Liam would return to a life of can't-do condemned by a diagnosis on paper. "Let's go to the living room," Chloe said, walking past Robert and back into the house. "And please, sir, if this works, don't clap, don't shout, just watch." The living room was just as they had left it, with toys scattered and the echo of the previous argument still hanging in the air. Finn, who had been left alone on the sofa, crying softly, looked up when he saw Chloe enter. He stretched out his arms, but Chloe made a gentle waiting gesture with her hand, a signal the child understood instantly. Mrs. Higgins appeared from the side hallway, drawn by the unexpected return. Seeing Chloe back in the living room, her face contorted into a grimace of indignation. "Sir, what is this woman still doing here?" the housekeeper snapped, advancing quickly. "I thought we had already cleared the house of—" "Silence, Mrs. Higgins." Robert barked without looking at her, his eyes fixed on Chloe and his son. The tone was so sharp that the old woman stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth open, offended and surprised. Robert stood by the doorway with his arms crossed, a defensive posture that hid his terror. He wanted to believe, but he was terrified of being disappointed again. Chloe walked to the center of the beige rug. She knelt slowly, bringing herself to Liam's eye level. With infinite delicacy, she peeled the child from her chest and set him on his feet on the rug. Her large, warm hands held the little one's waist. Liam wobbled. His little legs, encased in denim overalls, trembled visibly. He instinctively tried to grab Chloe's clothes, whimpering slightly. "You're holding him," Robert accused from the doorway, his voice laden with skepticism. "If you let go, he'll fall. That's what always happens." "Shh," Chloe hushed, without taking her eyes off the child's. "Liam, look at me, my love. You are strong, you are a giant." Chloe removed her hands from the child's waist, but kept them millimeters from his body, ready to catch him, creating an invisible force field of security. Liam stood there, swaying like a leaf in the wind, his knees bent inwards. "He's going to fall," Mrs. Higgins whispered venomously. "It's cruel." "I said be quiet," Robert roared, his heart pounding in his throat. Liam looked around, scared by the empty space. His eyes searched for his father, but Robert was a distant, blurry statue. Then they returned to Chloe. She was there, smiling, with that radiant smile that promised everything would be all right. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with pride. Chloe slowly backed away 1 step, 2 steps, crawling backwards on her knees, moving away from the child. "Come, Liam," she whispered, extending her arms. "Come to Nanny." "Come for a hug." The distance was barely a meter, but for a child with hypotonia, it was an abyss. Liam let out a whimper of frustration, looked at his feet, looked at Chloe, and then it happened. Liam clenched his tiny fists at his sides, his face furrowed in a gesture of absolute concentration. He took a deep breath, puffing out his small chest, and lifted his right foot. It wasn't an elegant movement. It was clumsy, heavy, a clumsy stomp against the timber floor that echoed in the sepulchral silence of the room. Robert stopped breathing. His nails dug into his own arms through the fabric of his suit. His left foot followed. One step. Liam leaned dangerously forward. Robert made to run and catch him, but Chloe looked up and shot him a furious glare that stopped him dead. "Trust," her eyes said. The child regained his balance, flailing his arms. He took another step and another. "My God," the whisper escaped Robert's lips like an involuntary prayer. They weren't the dragging steps of a sick child. They were the determined steps of a child with a goal. Liam let out a nervous giggle, a mix of fear and excitement, and then lunged forward in the last 2 steps, falling into Chloe's open arms. "That's it!" Chloe cheered, hugging him and rolling with him on the rug, showering his face with kisses. "You did it! You're a champion!" Finn, from the sofa, started clapping and laughing, infected by his brother's victory. The scene was irrefutable proof. No doctor, no machine, no thousands of dollars of therapy had achieved what this woman had accomplished, with patience, the floor, and love. Robert felt the ground open beneath him. His entire belief system, based on paying for the best and demanding immediate results, crumbled. He looked at his son, laughing in the arms of the common employee, and then he looked at his own empty hands. He realized, with a sharp pain in his chest, that he didn't know his son. He didn't know he could walk, didn't know he could be brave. He had missed the miracle because he was too busy judging the method. Mrs. Higgins, seeing that the narrative was slipping from her grasp, decided to play her last, dirtiest card. "Well," the old woman said with disdain, breaking the magical moment. "Walking is one thing, but decency is another. Sir, don't let this sideshow trick cloud your judgment. Remember what I told you. Remember what's missing from Mrs. Laura's safe." Robert, still with tears of amazement in his eyes, turned to Mrs. Higgins. The mention of the safe was like a bucket of ice water. The emotion of the miracle collided violently with the suspicion that had been sown. "What are you talking about?" Robert asked, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want to say it in front of her, sir." Mrs. Higgins lied, pointing a bony finger at Chloe. "But while you were away, I noticed that your late wife's diamond brooch was missing, the one you keep so carefully. And coincidentally, this woman is the only one who goes in to clean your study." Chloe slowly stood up, Liam still in her arms. Her face paled. "I have never touched anything from that safe," she said, her voice firm but trembling from the accusation. "Never." Robert looked at Chloe, then at his son, in her arms, and finally at Mrs. Higgins. Doubt settled back into his mind, toxic and swift. The physical miracle was undeniable, but the moral? Was it possible that this woman was an angel with the children and a devil with his assets? "Mrs. Higgins," Robert said, his face hardening again. "Are you sure of what you're saying?" "As sure as I'm standing here, sir. Check her backpack, check that old bag she carries. If she has nothing to fear, she won't mind us looking, will she?" The trap was set, and Robert, a man of facts and evidence, walked towards the canvas bag Chloe had left at the living room entrance. The tension in the room shifted from euphoria to police terror in a second. Robert's hand closed over the strap of the old canvas bag. The air in the room became unbreathable, charged with static electricity that made skin prickle. Liam, still in Chloe's arms, stopped laughing, feeling the tension in his nanny's body. Finn, from the sofa, put a finger to his mouth, watching with wide, scared eyes as his father invaded the only private property of the woman who gave them affection. Chloe didn't move to stop him, didn't scream, didn't protest. She simply squeezed Liam a little tighter against her chest, holding her chin high with a dignity that contrasted painfully with her wrinkled uniform and worn shoes. "If that's what you need to believe in my honesty, then do it," Chloe said. Her voice didn't tremble, though her knees did. "But you do it. Don't let her touch my things." Robert looked at Mrs. Higgins, who waited with a predatory smile, anticipating the sparkle of diamonds among the humble clothes. Then, with a sharp movement, Robert emptied the contents of the bag onto the glass coffee table, right next to the vase that was worth more than his employee's entire life. Objects fell, but there was no heavy sound of jewels. A hairbrush with worn bristles fell out. 2 pairs of white socks, mended at the heel, fell out. A box of hypertension pills with the generic pharmacy price still attached fell out, and a small, homemade laminated photograph fell out. Nothing else, no brooch, no money, nothing of material value. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert rummaged through the objects with his hand, hoping to find a false bottom, a secret pocket, something to justify the accusation and his own paranoia. But he only touched the dignified poverty of a working woman. He picked up the photograph. It was a blurry image of an elderly woman in a wheelchair, smiling with the same warmth as Chloe. On the back, a trembling handwriting read, "So you don't forget who you're fighting for, my daughter." Robert felt a sudden nausea. Shame crept up his neck like a burn. He had violated the intimacy of someone who only kept medicine for her mother and memories. "It's not here," Robert murmured, dropping the photo as if it burned him. Mrs. Higgins, whose face had gone from smugness to disbelief, stepped forward, losing her composure. "Impossible! It has to be there!" The old woman shrieked, lunging at the table and rummaging through the old socks with her bony hands. "Are you sure it's in her uniform pockets? Search her. That thief is cunning." "Sir, enough!" Robert's shout made the window panes vibrate. He grabbed Mrs. Higgins's wrist before she could touch Chloe. He looked at her with a cold fury, a mixture of disappointment and fed-upness. "There's been enough humiliation for today," Robert said, releasing the housekeeper's hand with disdain. "There's nothing. You were wrong. Or worse, you lied." "Sir, I would never." Mrs. Higgins began to defend herself, backing away, pale. "Go to the kitchen now," he ordered, without looking at her. When the old woman disappeared, grumbling and dragging her venom towards the hallway, Robert was left alone with Chloe and the children. The atmosphere changed, but it didn't relax. Robert's shame quickly transformed into a defensive barrier. He couldn't apologize. His pride as a powerful man didn't know how to bend so much without breaking. He had to maintain control. He had to be the boss. He picked up the medicine box and the photo and put them back in the bag with stiff movements. Then he looked at Chloe. She didn't look at him with hatred, but with a deep sadness that he found unbearable. "You've proven that my son can walk," Robert said, his voice regaining that formal, distant boardroom tone. "And you've proven you didn't steal anything today." "I've proven I'm a decent person, sir." "That should be enough," she replied. "In my world, decency is the minimum, not a merit," he retorted, sheltering behind his coldness. "Listen carefully, Chloe. I'm not going to fire you. I can't. Not after what I saw with Liam. You clearly have an influence over them that I don't understand, but it works." Chloe's eyes lit up slightly, a spark of hope, not for the money, but for not having to abandon the little ones. "But," Robert interrupted, raising an authoritative index finger, "things are going to change. You're staying, but you're on probation, real probation. No games on the floor, no shouting, no wild behavior. I want you to behave like a high-level professional." Robert walked around her, marking his territory. "You will wear a clean, ironed uniform always. The children will eat at the table, not on the sofa. If they play, it will be with educational toys. No human towers. I want order, Chloe. I want silence after 8 p.m. I want this house to be a respectable home again, not a playground. You have 1 week. If in 1 week I see a single yellow rubber glove lying in my living room, you leave without a cent. Understood?" It was a cruel deal. He asked her to stay but forbade her from using the very tools, play, laughter, uninhibited physical contact that had achieved the miracle. He asked her to heal his children, but without loving them too much. Chloe looked at Liam, who was playing with the buttons on her uniform. She knew that accepting those conditions was like trying to put out a fire with an eyedropper. But she looked at the child's legs, those legs that had just taken their first steps. If she left, those legs would atrophy again in a chair. "Understood, sir," she said softly. "I'll do it your way." "Good." Robert adjusted his tie, feeling falsely victorious. "Settle back in. Tomorrow I start working from the home office. I'll be watching every move. Don't disappoint me." Robert left the room without looking back, taking his loneliness with him and leaving Chloe with a bitter victory. She had the job, but her soul had been forbidden. The next 3 days were a torture of gray velvet. The house, once punctuated by sudden bursts of laughter, had fallen under a blanket of suffocating correctness. Robert kept his word, cancelled the rest of his Sydney agenda, and shut himself in his study, a dark, timber-panelled room on the first floor, the door ajar just enough to hear what was happening downstairs. He sat at his computer, pretending to review balances and contracts, but his senses were completely focused on the hallway and the living room. He was a spy in his own castle. He wanted to prove to himself that he was right, that order brought peace, that structure brought well-being. But what he heard was slowly killing him. He heard Chloe's rhythmic, soft steps. He heard her voice, now moderate, saying things like, "Sit up straight, Finn. Don't throw your food, darling." Mr. Robert gets cross. He heard the silence, a heavy, dense silence, only broken by an occasional, brief cry from the twins. A cry of boredom and frustration that Chloe quickly calmed with a, "Shh, it'll pass, it'll pass." There was no laughter, no running, no life. On the third day, curiosity overcame pride. Robert rose from his ergonomic leather chair and tiptoed to the door. He peered into the hallway that led to the internal balcony, from which he could see the living room downstairs without being seen. The scene he saw shattered his preconceptions. The children were sitting on the rug, surrounded by expensive imported wooden toys and neutral-colored building blocks. They were clean, impeccable, with side-parted hair. Chloe was sitting in a chair watching them, her hands crossed in her lap, just as he had ordered, like a professional. It looked like a photo from a decorating magazine, perfect, cold, dead. Finn held a red block, looked at it with disinterest, and dropped it. Liam was lying face down, sucking his thumb, his gaze lost on the ceiling. He wasn't trying to get up, wasn't trying to walk. Why? There was no one on the floor waiting for him with open arms. Robert felt a sharp pain in his chest. Was this what he wanted? Children who looked like mannequins? Was this the decency that Mrs. Higgins so defended? Suddenly, Chloe looked at the wall clock. It was 11 a.m. She knew Robert usually had video conferences at that time and wore headphones. Believing the ogre was disconnected from the world, Chloe transformed. It was subtle at first. She slipped from the chair to the floor, not with noise but like a cat. She silently took off her shoes, approached Liam, and whispered something in his ear. The child, who had seemed like a wilting plant seconds before, opened his eyes wide, and a mischievous smile lit up his face. Chloe pulled from her pocket not the yellow gloves, but 2 socks with little faces painted on the toes. She put them on her hands. "Hello, I'm Mr. Potato," Chloe whispered, making a deep, ridiculous voice, moving her right hand in front of Finn's face. Finn let out a muffled giggle, covering his mouth with his hands, as if he knew they were committing a crime. "I'm Mrs. Tomato," she replied with her other hand, tickling Liam's tummy. The effect was electric. The room's energy changed instantly. Color returned to the children's cheeks. Liam sat up, giggling, trying to catch Mr. Potato. Finn pounced on Chloe's back, hugging her. Robert, from his hiding place above, saw Chloe rolling on the floor with them, but this time in total silence. They played mimes, made exaggerated gestures, opened their mouths, simulating war cries that made no sound, jumped on the cushions, landing with feather-light softness. It was a clandestine dance of happiness. He saw how Chloe helped Liam stand up. Without saying a word, she offered him her hands, now disguised as puppets. Liam stood up, trembling but determined, and took 3 steps towards her, biting his tongue with concentration and joy. "Bravo!" Chloe gestured silently, clapping without a sound. Robert retreated from the balcony, his back pressed against the hallway wall. His heart pounded wildly. He realized he was the villain of that story. He had created a golden prison, where happiness had to be smuggled, as if it were illegal. Chloe wasn't disobeying out of rebellion, she was disobeying out of love. She was saving his children from the sadness he himself imposed. He looked down at his own hands. They were clean, well-groomed, perfect, and empty. He had never played sock puppets. He had never rolled on the floor. His wife Laura used to tell him, "Robert, the house can be cleaned, but childhood doesn't come back." He had forgotten. Just as he was about to go down, he didn't know, maybe to join them, maybe to apologize. A shadow crossed his peripheral vision. Mrs. Higgins was at the end of the opposite hallway. She hadn't seen Robert spying. She was also spying on the living room below, but her expression was not one of revelation or tenderness. Her eyes were narrowed, fixed on the mute happiness of Chloe and the children. In her hands, Mrs. Higgins gripped a cleaning cloth so tightly that her knuckles were white. Robert watched as the old woman turned and silently entered the master bedroom, Robert's room, where the safe was. An alarm sounded in Robert's head, not a robbery alarm, but something much more sinister. He remembered the brooch accusation. He remembered the certainty with which Mrs. Higgins had demanded to search the bag. And now, seeing her sneak into his room while Chloe was distracted downstairs, Robert didn't go down to the living room. Instead, he took off his expensive leather shoes to make no noise. He became the silent hunter his house needed. He walked towards his own room, stopping just before the doorway, holding his breath. What he saw through the crack left him colder than any previous slight. Mrs. Higgins wasn't cleaning. Mrs. Higgins was in front of his bedside table with the small velvet box where he kept his grandfather's gold watch and the diamond brooch that had supposedly already disappeared. The old woman opened the box. The sparkle of the diamonds flashed in the gloom, but she didn't put it in her pocket to steal it. She held it in her hand, looked at it with hatred, and then left the room, but not towards the exit. She headed towards the hallway cupboard, where Chloe hung her coat and left her canvas bag while working. Robert understood everything in a second of brutal clarity. There had been no theft. There was going to be a trap. Mrs. Higgins didn't want the money. She wanted Chloe's destruction and was about to execute the final phase of her plan. Just now that Robert was beginning to see the light. The millionaire felt a new, different anger. It wasn't the hot, reactive anger of the offended father. It was the cold, calculating, and lethal anger of the businessman who discovers he has been betrayed by his right-hand woman. He retreated into the shadows of the hallway, letting Mrs. Higgins pass by with the brooch in her hand, heading towards Chloe's bag. "Do it," Robert whispered to himself, his dark eyes fixed on the old woman's back. "Dig your own grave, Mrs. Higgins. Today, the tyranny in this house ends." But before acting, he needed definitive proof. He needed the crime to be consummated so there would be no excuses. No, it was a misunderstanding. No crocodile tears from a 40-year employee. Robert returned to his study, turned on the internal security camera monitor, the ones Mrs. Higgins believed he never looked at, and pressed the record button. The war for the soul of the house had begun, and Robert, for the first time, knew which side he had to fight on. The monitor screen emitted an almost imperceptible electrical hum, but to Robert, it sounded like an alarm siren. From the darkness of his study, now an improvised surveillance booth, he watched the grainy black and white image transmitted by the staff hallway camera. His hands, resting on the mahogany desk, were clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles had turned white. On the monitor, Mrs. Higgins was not the helpful old woman who brought tea. She was a furtive shadow. Robert watched her stop in front of the built-in cupboard where Chloe kept her canvas bag. The woman glanced from side to side of the hallway, an instinctive gesture of guilt, checking that there were no eyewitnesses. She didn't know that the digital eye of her employer was dissecting her from upstairs. Mrs. Higgins took the brooch from her pocket. Through the screen, the sparkle of the diamonds was barely a white dot of light, but Robert recognized the shape. It was the butterfly brooch he had given his wife Laura on their last anniversary. Seeing that jewel, a symbol of pure and tragic love, in the poisonous hands of his housekeeper, caused him a physical retch of repulsion. With quick, nervous movements, Mrs. Higgins unzipped Chloe's bag. She plunged her hand deep inside, searching for a secure hiding place among the nanny's humble clothes. Robert held his breath, feeling a mix of morbid fascination and volcanic fury. He was witnessing a crime in real time. He was watching a lie being fabricated, designed to destroy an innocent life. Mrs. Higgins withdrew her hand, closed the bag, and smoothed the fabric to erase any trace of her manipulation. Then she ran a hand through her gray hair, composed her face into that mask of pious severity she often wore, and walked towards the living room. Robert slumped back in his chair, exhaling the air he had held. The recording continued to run. He had the proof. He had the smoking gun. But what he felt was not relief. It was corrosive guilt. How many times had this happened before? He remembered the nurse from 3 months ago, the one who lost a silver watch. He remembered the young girl who was fired because she supposedly broke an expensive antique vase. Mrs. Higgins had always been the witness, the discoverer, the savior of the family estate. "I've been blind," Robert murmured, running his hands over his face. "I've let a viper tend my nest." Downstairs in the living room, the atmosphere remained one of clandestine peace. Chloe, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued to play with the twins. Robert could imagine their smiles, could feel the warmth they radiated, even through the walls and floor that separated them. Chloe was mending his children with love and old socks, while upstairs, the machinery of hatred was setting in motion to crush her. Robert stood up. He wasn't going to rush down screaming. That would be too easy for Mrs. Higgins. She would deny it, say she was looking for something. She would invent an excuse. No, Robert needed the betrayal to be total. He needed Mrs. Higgins to expose herself, to speak the words, to point the finger. He needed to see how far human wickedness would go when it felt unpunished. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusted his tie, and adopted the coldest, most inscrutable expression from his businessman's repertoire. He was going down to the stage, but this time he wouldn't be Mrs. Higgins's puppet. He would be the judge, the jury, and, God willing, the moral executioner of the woman who had poisoned his home. Meanwhile, in the living room, Mrs. Higgins entered. She made no sound. At first, she stood in the doorway, watching Chloe help Liam stack 3 wooden blocks. The happiness of the scene was unbearable for the old woman. To see that pauper taking the place of a mother, receiving the smiles of the heirs, was a personal insult to her 40 years of strict service. "Enjoy it while you can, girl, Mrs." Higgins whispered to herself, caressing the empty pocket of her apron, where the brooch had once been. Winter has come. Mrs. Higgins took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air for the theatrical scream that would break the harmony. It was time to act. Mrs. Higgins's cry wasn't human. It was the shriek of a wounded seagull, designed to cut the air and chill the blood. "Sir, Mr. Robert." The impact in the room was immediate. The tower of blocks Liam had just built with such effort collapsed when the child started violently. Finn, who was laughing on the floor, burst into tears instantly, terrified by the shrill volume. Chloe, with the reflexes of someone accustomed to protecting, lunged forward, covering both children with her arms, looking towards the door with wide eyes, expecting to see a fire or an armed intruder. But she only saw Mrs. Higgins. The housekeeper stood in the middle of the room, hands on her head, acting a nervous breakdown worthy of an Academy Award. "It's the limit! It's the end!" the old woman screamed, looking at the ceiling as if begging for divine mercy. "I can't stay silent any longer. My conscience won't allow it." Robert appeared at the top of the stairs. He descended the steps with exasperating slowness, his face stony. He didn't run. He didn't ask what was happening. He simply descended like a storm cloud charged with static electricity. "What is the meaning of this uproar, Mrs. Higgins?" Robert asked as he reached the last step. His voice was low, controlled, but it had a dangerous edge that Mrs. Higgins, in her malicious euphoria, failed to detect. "Sir!" Mrs. Higgins ran towards him, wringing her hands in a gesture of supplication. "I've tried to be patient. I've tried to give this person a chance. But there are limits. Your wife's blood cries for justice." Chloe slowly stood up with Finn clinging to her right leg and Liam in her arms. Fear closed her throat. She knew she hadn't done anything, but she also knew that in the world of the wealthy, the truth of the poor is worth less than dust. "What are you talking about?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling but dignified. "You know what I'm talking about, you hypocrite." "Mrs. Higgins spat, turning to her with bloodshot eyes. "I've noticed things, sir. Small things, disappearing coins, cutlery, but today she's gone too far. I went to clean your bedside table, sir, as I do every Friday, and the blue velvet box was open." Robert didn't blink. He kept his gaze fixed on Mrs. Higgins. "The butterfly brooch." "Mrs." Higgins cried, clutching a hand to her chest. "Mrs. Laura's brooch is gone, and the only person who has been lurking upstairs while you were working, sir, is her. I saw her go up with the excuse of looking for clean towels." It was a clumsy lie. Chloe hadn't been upstairs all day. She was forbidden from setting foot on the second floor, except by express order, but the accusation hung in the air, heavy and toxic. "I didn't go upstairs, sir," Chloe said quickly, looking Robert in the eyes. "I haven't left this room. You were upstairs. You know I didn't go up." Robert didn't respond to Chloe. He remained silent, letting the panic grow, letting Mrs. Higgins grow confident. "She's lying," Mrs. Higgins insisted. "They're like rats, sir. They move in the shadows, but this time I've got her. I'm sure she hasn't had time to take it out of the house. She must have it in her belongings, ready to take it as soon as her shift ends. I demand we search her bag right now, for the memory of your late wife." The twins cried inconsolably, sensing the aggression in the atmosphere. Liam hid his face in Chloe's neck, soaking her uniform with tears. "Not again," Chloe whispered, and a tear of helplessness rolled down her cheek. "You already searched my things once. How many more times do you need to humiliate me? As many times as necessary until the truth appears," Mrs. Higgins said, and without waiting for permission, she ran towards the hallway cupboard where Chloe's bag was. Robert followed her at a slow pace. Chloe, carrying Liam and dragging Finn by the hand, followed too, because she had no choice. It was a funeral procession towards her own social execution. Mrs. Higgins pulled out the bag violently, throwing it onto the foyer floor. "Open it, sir," the old woman demanded. "Open it, and see with your own eyes whom you've brought into your house." Robert looked at the bag, then at Chloe. The young nanny was pale, trembling from head to toe. "Sir, I swear on my mother's life, I have nothing," Chloe pleaded. Her voice broke. I just want to look after the children. I don't want your jewels. I don't need them." "That's what all thieves say," Mrs. Higgins declared. Robert knelt. His perfectly manicured hands touched the worn canvas. He slowly opened the zipper. The sound of the zipper tearing through the silence was unbearable. Mrs. Higgins leaned forward with a shark-like smile, awaiting the gleam of triumph. Robert reached in, pushed aside the clothes, and his fingers closed around cold metal and hard stones. He slowly pulled it out. The butterfly brooch shimmered under the light of the foyer lamp. The diamond sparkled with ironic purity amidst so much moral dirt. "Aha!" Mrs. Higgins shouted triumphantly, pointing a finger like a sword. "There it is. I knew it. Thief, miserable woman. You've stolen from a dead woman." Chloe let out a gasp of horror. She put her hands to her mouth, letting go of the children for a second. She backed up until she hit the wall. "No," Chloe murmured, shaking her head, her eyes filled with terror. "That's not mine. I didn't put it there. Someone? Mrs. Higgins scoffed. "Who? Ghosts? The babies? You? We caught you red-handed." The old woman turned to Robert, expecting to see an explosion of rage, expecting to see him kick the girl out, expecting the order to call the police. "Sir, call the authorities. Get her arrested. Make her learn that you don't mess with family." Robert stood up, holding the brooch aloft. He looked at it in the light, turning it. Then he lowered his hand and looked at Chloe. He saw absolute terror on her face, the devastation of someone who knows that truth doesn't matter when the evidence is rigged. He saw his children crying at her feet, clinging to her legs like shipwreck survivors to a mast. And then, Robert slowly turned his head towards Mrs. Higgins. The old woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. There was something in Robert's gaze that didn't fit. There was no uncontrolled fury. There was a glacial calm, a deep and terrifying darkness. "You're right, Mrs. Higgins," Robert said, his voice echoing in the marble foyer. "You don't mess with my family." "Exactly, sir. That's why you must—" "Tell me one thing," Robert interrupted her, taking a step towards the housekeeper, invading her personal space. "How did you know it was at the bottom of the bag, under the socks?" Mrs. Higgins blinked nervously. I supposed. Thieves always hide things at the bottom." "It's instinct, sir." "Instinct," Robert repeated, savoring the word with disgust. "Curious instinct, because, from where you were standing, it was impossible to see the bottom of the bag before I reached my hand in." The air in the room changed. Mrs. Higgins's trap had closed, but she still didn't realize her own foot was caught in the snare. "Sir, what are you implying?" "Mrs. Higgins asked, her voice losing strength. "The evidence is there. She stole it." "The evidence is there, yes," Robert said, gripping the brooch in his fist. "But the truth is something far more complicated, don't you think?" Chloe watched the scene, confused, her heart pounding. Why wasn't he shouting at her? Why was he looking at Mrs. Higgins with that predatory intensity? "Chloe," Robert said, without taking his eyes off the old woman. "Take the children, take them to their room, close the door, and cover their ears." "Sir?" Chloe tried to speak. "Do it," Robert ordered. And this time he shouted, but not with anger towards her, but with an urgency of protection. Chloe, trembling, carried Liam and took Finn by the hand, running upstairs, fleeing the nightmare. When the sound of the children's footsteps disappeared and the click of the bedroom door closing was heard, Robert was left alone with Mrs. Higgins in the foyer. The silence was absolute. Mrs. Higgins took a step back, feeling real fear for the first time. "Sir, you're scaring me. We should call the police and get this over with." "Oh, don't worry, Mrs. Higgins," Robert said, taking his mobile phone from his pocket with his free hand. "We are going to get this over with, but I won't call the police just yet. First, I want to show you a movie. A very interesting movie I just filmed." Robert unlocked his phone. His fingers moved across the screen, looking for the file connected to the security cloud. "Movie?" Mrs. Higgins asked, her voice a thread. Robert turned the phone screen towards her. "Look," he whispered. On the small, bright screen, the service hallway was visible in black and white. An elderly woman in a grey uniform was seen looking from side to side. She was seen taking a shining brooch from her pocket. She was seen opening the bag. "Mrs." Higgins's face crumbled. The mask of the loyal servant melted, revealing the naked terror of a caught criminal. Her knees knocked together. "Sir, I can explain," she stammered, backing towards the door. "There's nothing to explain," Robert said, advancing towards her relentlessly. "What needs to be decided now is whether you will leave this house walking or in a police car." The climax had arrived, but not as Mrs. Higgins had written it. Divine Justice had just entered the foyer, and it wore a suit and tie. The phone continued to replay the video in a loop, showing the betrayal in black and white. Mrs. Higgins looked at the screen as if it were a mirror reflecting her own rotten soul, and for the first time in decades, she had no quick answer, no sharp lie, no pious excuse. 40 years, the old woman whispered, her voice trembling, not with regret, but with impotent rage. I have given 40 years of my life to this family. I have cleaned up your messes. I have kept your secrets, and you are going to throw me out for a piece of metal, for a trinket? Robert slowly put his phone back in his pocket. The calm he felt was terrifying, even to himself. It was the calm of one who has survived a shipwreck and sees the shore. I'm not throwing you out for the metal, Mrs. Higgins, Robert said, taking a step towards the front door and opening it wide. The night air entered the foyer, cold and clean. I'm throwing you out because you tried to destroy an innocent person to feed your ego. I'm throwing you out because you turned my grief into a dictatorship. I'm throwing you out because in trying to protect my house, you turned it into a prison. Mrs. Higgins straightened up. If she was going to fall, she wouldn't do it on her knees. Her face hardened, regaining that mask of aristocratic disdain she had copied from her former employers. I do what I do for the good of the lineage, she spat, smoothing her apron with furious hands. That girl, that nobody, she's going to ruin those children. She's going to make them weak, soft, like her. You think you've won, Mr. Robert, but you're left alone with the chaos. When those children grow up and don't know how to behave in society, you'll remember me. I'd rather they be happy than decent like you, Robert replied, pointing to the darkness of the street. Out. You have 10 minutes to get your things off my property. If in 11 minutes you're still here, I'll call the police and show them the video. And believe me, judges don't like jewel thieves, no matter how old they are. Mrs. Higgins let out a snort of contempt. She walked towards the door, her hard-soled shoes echoing for the last time on the marble she had polished so meticulously. At the threshold, she stopped and turned. Her eyes were two wells of bitterness. Mrs. Laura would never have allowed this. She launched her last poisoned dart. Robert felt the hit, but this time he didn't bleed. Mrs. Laura, Robert said in a firm voice, would have fired anyone who made her children cry. Goodbye, Mrs. Higgins. The old woman stepped out into the night without looking back. Robert closed the door. The dry thud of the bolt resonated throughout the house, a definitive sound. The silence that followed was not the oppressive silence from before. It was a silence of emptiness, of cleared space. The shadow was gone, but the crisis wasn't over. Upstairs, the damage was already done. Robert climbed the stairs. His legs weighed tons. Each step was an accusation. He had allowed that to happen. He had been an accomplice by omission. He reached the second-floor hallway. The children's bedroom door was closed. From inside, there were no hysterical cries, but something much more heartbreaking, a soft, trembling murmur. Robert pressed his ear to the wood. Sleep, little one. Your mum's in the field, Chloe sang. Her voice was broken by suppressed tears. She was off-key from fear, but she kept singing, even at the moment she believed she was going to be arrested, that she was going to lose her reputation and her freedom. Her priority was still to calm Finn and Liam. Robert leaned his forehead against the door. He felt a sharp pang of pain in his chest, so acute that he had to close his eyes. That was the circus he had despised. That fierce loyalty was what he had called a lack of professionalism. He felt like the poorest man in the world. He gently turned the knob. It was locked. Chloe had bolted it, barricading herself against the monster she believed was coming for her. Chloe, he called. His voice came out hoarse, unrecognizable. Chloe, open up, please. The singing stopped abruptly. There was a choked sob and the sound of someone moving to protect something. Don't come in, she pleaded from the other side, her voice panicked. Please, sir, don't let the police in here, not in front of them. I'll come out. I'll give myself up. But don't scare the children. The request tore at his soul. She was negotiating her own capture to protect the children's innocence. There's no police, Chloe, Robert said, pressing his hand flat against the wood. Mrs. Higgins is gone. It's over. Open the door. I need you to see something. There was a long, tense silence. Robert could hear her agitated breathing on the other side. Finally, the latch clicked. The door opened a few centimeters. Chloe peeked out. Her eyes were swollen and red, her makeup smudged, her hair messy. She held Liam in one arm like a shield, and Finn clung to her leg, hidden behind her skirt. She looked at him with terror, expecting the trap, expecting handcuffs. Robert didn't push the door open. He stayed in the hallway, respecting her space, his hands open and empty to show that he brought nothing but his own shame. "She's gone," he repeated. "I fired her." Chloe blinked, confused, hugging the baby tighter. "You fired her?" "But the brooch," she said. "She put it there?" Robert took out his phone again. "I have it recorded. I saw everything." Chloe looked at the phone, then at Robert. Her shoulders, which had been tense as violin strings, slumped. The relief was so physical that she had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. Liam, sensing the danger had passed, rested his head on her shoulder and sighed. "So, I'm not going to jail?" she asked, with an innocence that Robert found unbearable. "No," Robert said, shaking his head, swallowing the lump in his throat. "The only person who should be judged in this house is me, for doubting you." Chloe opened the door completely, allowing Robert to enter the sanctuary of the children's room. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by a star-shaped nightlight. There were toys on the floor, but it didn't feel messy. It felt lived in. Robert entered, feeling like an intruder in his own home. Chloe walked to the cot and gently placed Liam in it. The child, exhausted by the day's drama, immediately snuggled in. Finn, who was still awake, looked at his father with distrust from behind the nanny's legs. "Forgive me, sir," Chloe said, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "I was just so scared. My mother depends on me. If I go to prison, she'll die." Robert sat on a low chair, one of those small story-reading chairs he never used. He was at Finn's height. "Chloe," Robert said, looking at his clasped hands. "Don't apologize to me. Never again apologize to me." Robert looked up. His eyes, usually cold and analytical, were moist. "I saw the video of the theft. Yes, but then I kept watching more." Chloe tensed slightly. "More? I reviewed the recordings from last week. From the days I was away and you thought you were alone," Robert confessed. Chloe lowered her head, embarrassed. "Sir, I know we danced in the kitchen, and I let Finn eat ice cream on the rug. I cleaned it, I swear." "I wasn't looking at the messes, Chloe," Robert interrupted her in a soft voice. "I was looking at my children." Robert took out his tablet, which he had brought with him from the study, and turned it on. The bluish light illuminated his tired face. He searched for a file and pressed play. He turned the screen so Chloe could see it. It was a recording from 2 days ago. In the image, Chloe was sitting on the living room floor with a giant book open. Finn and Liam sat beside her, mesmerized. Chloe wasn't just reading. She was acting, doing voices, moving her arms, becoming the monster and the princess. But what Robert pointed out wasn't Chloe, but the children. "Look at Finn," Robert said, pointing to the screen. "Look how he looks at you." In the video, Finn looked at Chloe with absolute adoration, copying her gestures, laughing before she finished the joke. And Liam, the child who supposedly couldn't move, was trying to climb onto Chloe's back to see the book better, using a strength and coordination that doctors said he didn't have. "I didn't know Finn could clap," Robert whispered, his voice breaking. "I saw it in the video. He learned to clap last Tuesday with you. I missed it." He moved to the next video. It was the meal scene. Chloe was making aeroplane sounds with the spoon. The children ate vegetables without protesting, laughing. "I didn't know Liam liked broccoli," Robert continued, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. "With me, he spits it out. With you, he eats it laughing." Robert turned off the tablet and placed it on the floor. He covered his face with his hands. The wall of ice finally broke. The millionaire, the man of iron, began to cry. A silent, deep cry that shook his shoulders. "I thought I gave them everything," Robert sobbed. "The best house, the best clothes, the best doctors. And you arrived with rubber gloves and old socks, and you gave them the only thing I couldn't give them. Life." Chloe stood frozen. She had never seen a man like him. So powerful, break down like this. The instinct that made her care for the children activated towards the father. She approached slowly, hesitating. "Sir, you love them," she said softly. "That's what's important. Love is learned, just like Liam learned to walk. You just need to lose your fear of getting down on the floor." Robert lifted his red, wet face. He looked at Finn, who had approached curiously upon seeing his father cry. The child, with that pure empathy of childhood, stretched out his small hand and touched Robert's knee. "Dad." "Ouch," Finn said. It was a bullet to the heart. "Yes, Finn, Dad has a big ouch in here," Robert said, touching his chest. Without thinking, Robert did something he hadn't done since his wife's funeral. He slid from the chair and sat on the floor, on the rug, at the same level as his son and the nanny. He didn't care that his $3,000 suit trousers would wrinkle. He didn't care about dignity. He extended his arms towards Finn. The child hesitated for a second, looking at Chloe. She nodded with a warm smile, giving him permission. Finn walked towards his father and let himself be hugged. Robert buried his face in his son's hair, smelling of baby shampoo and innocence. "Chloe," Robert said from the floor, without letting go of the child, "I don't want you to work for me." Chloe felt a sudden cold. After all this, he was firing her. "Sir, I don't want you to be my employee," Robert corrected, looking up. His eyes no longer had barriers. "I want you to be part of this family. I want you to teach me, not how to clean or tidy. I want you to teach me how to be the father they see in you." Robert extended a hand towards her. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a gesture of deep respect, as equals, a blood pact. "Stay, please, not for the salary. I'll double your salary. I'll give you whatever you want. Stay to teach me how to play." Chloe looked at Robert's hand. She looked at Finn, hugging him. She looked at Liam, sleeping in the cot. She understood that the battle was over. The coldness of the mansion was dissipating. Chloe smiled, and this time it was a calm smile, without fear. "I'll stay, Robert," she said, taking Robert's hand, "but with one condition." "Whatever it is," he said quickly. "Tomorrow, you put on the sock puppets. I'll be the audience." Robert let out a laugh, a real laugh, rusty but genuine, that sounded strange in that room accustomed to silence. "Deal," he said. And at that moment, under the dim light of the star lamp, with the wealthy father on the floor and the poor nanny standing, the true fortune of that house was sealed. It wasn't in the safe. It was on the rug. The next morning didn't dawn like any other in the mansion. Usually, the sun entered through the armored windows, illuminating dust particles in a mausoleum-like silence. But today, the sun seemed to enter with permission to touch everything. Robert came down to the kitchen at 8 o'clock, as his biological clock dictated. However, for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't wearing his Italian-cut navy suit, nor a silk tie tightened around his neck like an elegant noose. He wore gray tracksuit pants and a white cotton t-shirt, clothes he had rescued from the bottom of a forgotten drawer, remnants of a time when he, too, knew what a lazy Sunday was like. Upon entering the kitchen, the smell wasn't that of the black, bitter coffee Mrs. Higgins used to serve him in solitude. It smelled of vanilla, warm milk, and toasted bread. Chloe stood with her back to him, humming a soft tune while stirring a pan. Finn was in his high chair, his face stained with fruit puree, hitting the tray with a plastic spoon. Seeing his father, the child paused. There was a second of hesitation, a conditioned reflex from months of coldness. But Robert, instead of ignoring him or demanding silence, did something that changed the room's atmosphere. He winked at him. "Good morning, champ," Robert said, approaching the high chair. Finn let out a nervous giggle and hit the table again, this time with enthusiasm. Chloe turned, surprised by her employer's informality. "Good morning, Robert," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes still showed a slight trace of swelling from crying the night before, but her gaze was clear and calm. "I didn't know you'd be down so early. Coffee's almost ready." "I don't want coffee, Chloe," he replied, sitting in one of the kitchen chairs, not at the head of the formal dining table. "Today, I want what they're having." Chloe smiled, a smile that lit up the kitchen, more than the halogen lights. "Banana mash with biscuits?" she asked, amused. "If that's what gives you energy to keep up with these two, then yes, mash," Robert said, taking the spoon Finn offered him. That breakfast marked the end of an era and the beginning of another. There were no business meetings, no calls to Sydney. Robert spent the morning learning, and it was the hardest lesson of his life. He discovered that running a multinational was child's play, compared to changing a moving nappy or convincing Liam not to put a Lego piece up his nose. Mid-morning, the front doorbell rang. The dry sound reverberated through the house. Robert tensed. Chloe, who was on the floor helping Liam stretch his legs, looked up in fear. "It must be her," Chloe whispered. Mrs. Higgins had threatened to come back for the rest of her things. Robert stood up. His posture changed. The playful father disappeared for a second, and the man of steel returned. But this time, the steel was a shield for his family. "Stay here," he ordered softly. "I'll handle it." Robert walked towards the entrance. Opening the door, he found not Mrs. Higgins, but a courier with a box. And behind him, on the footpath, a police car that had come to take a statement regarding the complaint of attempted theft that Mrs. Higgins, in her delirium of revenge, had tried to file against Chloe that very morning, alleging wrongful dismissal. The old woman's audacity knew no bounds. Even outside the house, she tried to continue manipulating reality. Robert stepped onto the porch. The police officer approached, notebook in hand. "Good morning, sir. We have a complaint from a Mrs. Higgins. She says your employee verbally assaulted her and stole from her." Robert raised his hand, stopping the officer with a gesture of absolute authority. "Officer," Robert said in a calm voice, "Mrs. Higgins was dismissed yesterday for continuous theft and defamation. I have high-definition security recordings that show her herself extracting jewels from my safe to incriminate the nanny. If she wishes to proceed with this false accusation, I would be delighted to hand you the USB drive with the evidence right now, so you can proceed with her immediate arrest for false accusation and domestic theft." The officer paused, lowered his notebook, and changed his tone. "I understand, sir. If there is video evidence, the situation changes drastically. I will speak with the lady to dissuade her." "Do more than that," Robert said, taking a step closer, his gaze icy. "Tell her that if she ever utters my family's name again, or comes within 500 meters of this house, she will be the one ending up in jail, and there will be no bail to get her out." The police car left. Mrs. Higgins's shadow dissipated definitively, not by magic, but by the firmness of a father who no longer delegated the protection of his home. Returning to the living room, Robert brought with him something more important than legal victory. He brought an envelope he had been preparing in his study during the early hours. He found Chloe sitting on the sofa with Liam asleep in her lap. The image was of such profound peace that Robert felt afraid to break it. He sat opposite her at the coffee table, ignoring etiquette. "Chloe," he said softly. She opened her eyes, alert. "Everything's fine, Robert, perfectly fine. Mrs. Higgins won't bother us ever again." The relief on Chloe's face was palpable. She sighed deeply, stroking the sleeping child's back. "But we need to talk business," Robert continued, placing the envelope on the table. Chloe looked at the white envelope. Fear returned to her eyes. Was it a confidentiality agreement? New, strict rules? "Robert, I promise I'll abide by everything we discussed last night." "The socks, the play, open it," he interrupted her. Chloe carefully took the envelope, trying not to wake Liam. She pulled out the paper. It wasn't a severance check. It was a new employment contract. Her eyes scanned the lines and widened when she reached the salary figure and the final clause. "Robert, this is too much. It's triple what I was earning. And here it says," Chloe read aloud, her voice trembling, "full medical coverage for the employee and direct first-degree family members." Robert nodded, looking at his clasped hands. "You told me your mother was ill, that she depended on you. I did a little research last night. I know the treatments for her condition are expensive, and the public health system has months-long waiting lists." "Yes, sir. She's been waiting 6 months for a hip operation." "Not anymore," Robert said, looking up and meeting her eyes with a human intensity. "I've spoken with Dr. Miller, head of orthopedics at St. Vincent's Hospital. They're expecting her on Monday, all expenses paid." Chloe brought her hand to her mouth. Tears burst forth suddenly, without warning. She wasn't crying for the money. She was crying because someone had seen her invisible pain. She was crying because the man who seemed like a robot 24 hours ago had just saved her mother's life. "Why?" she asked in a thin voice. "Why are you doing this for me? I'm just the nanny." "No," Robert corrected firmly. "You are the woman who taught my son to walk when I didn't believe in him. You are the one who brought laughter back to this house when I only brought silence. Saving your mother is the least I can do to thank you for saving my children." "And me." Chloe couldn't contain herself. With Liam still in her arms, she leaned forward and took Robert's hand. She didn't kiss it. She simply squeezed it tightly, conveying a gratitude that couldn't be expressed in words. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Robert." "Call me Robert," he said, squeezing her hand back. "Just Robert. Epilogue." 6 months later, snow fell softly over the garden, covering the perfectly manicured lawn with a white blanket. But inside the house, the climate was tropical. The living room, which once looked like a luxury hotel lobby, had undergone a radical transformation. The beige leather sofa was still there, but now it was covered with brightly colored blankets and mismatched cushions. In the corner, where there used to be a cold, abstract metal sculpture, there was now a mountain of cushions serving as a fort. And in the center of the rug, the millionaire was unrecognizable. Robert was lying face up, dressed in jeans worn at the knees. In his right hand, he wore a blue sock with hand-stitched button eyes. In his left, a red one with yellow wool-simulating hair. "Attention, citizens of Rugland," Robert bellowed in a feigned, deep voice, making the blue sock puppet talk. "The tickle monster is approaching. Two small whirlwinds shot out from behind the sofa. Finn and Liam, now 18 months old and running with enviable stability, launched their attack. "Ah, Daddy!" they screamed, laughing heartily, throwing themselves on him mercilessly. Liam, the child who wasn't supposed to walk, ran the fastest of the two. His legs were strong, his movements confident. He belly flopped onto his father's stomach, laughing hysterically as Robert attacked him with Mr. Sock. Chloe watched the scene from the kitchen doorway with a hot cup of tea in her hands. She no longer wore the blue uniform and rubber gloves. She wore comfortable clothes, jeans, and a wool sweater. She still worked there, but her role had mutated. She was no longer the invisible employee. She was the aunt, the confidante, the partner in parenting. Robert, trapped under the weight of his children's love, turned his head and saw Chloe watching them. "Help!" he cried dramatically, extending his hand towards her. "Chloe, save me! They're devouring me!" Chloe laughed, placed her cup on a small table, and approached slowly. "Sorry, Robert," she said with a mischievous smile. "In the jungle of the living room, only the strongest survive." And instead of helping him, Chloe also threw herself to the floor, joining the tickle battle. The four rolled around on the expensive rug, an indistinguishable mass of arms, legs, and laughter. At that moment, if someone had taken a photo, they wouldn't have been able to tell who was the owner of the mansion and who was the employee. They would only have seen a family, a strange family, mended with broken pieces that had come together with the strongest glue in the world. Shared time on the floor. The camera slowly zooms out through the window, showing the house lit up in the middle of the winter night. It was no longer the quietest and most elegant house in the neighborhood. It was the loudest and undoubtedly the richest. Robert had learned the final lesson. A man is not a millionaire by what he has in the bank, but by how many times his children run to him when he walks through the door. And as he hugged Liam and Finn, feeling their hearts beat against his, Robert knew that he had finally truly come home, and